Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the third in this series of four talks about the idea of the everlasting covenant. Now, in the first talk, we talked about what the everlasting covenant is, why it's so central to the Bible as a whole, and how we, as part of our job as humans, have the role of protecting and upholding the covenant and thereby protecting creation. In the second talk, last time, we talked about how the covenant gets broken and how, when that happens, all of creation is at risk of kind of unraveling like a tapestry coming apart. And in this talk, we're going to focus on how you mend a broken covenant, how you repair the damage when it's been done. And right at the heart of this is the idea of atonement. Now, as we began to discover in the first talk, atonement was absolutely central to what happened in the first temple. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, that was the only time each year when the high priest was allowed to come in to the Holy of Holies. So you can see right away that this is something that's both incredibly important in that worldview and that's central to what the temple is all about and that worldview of the everlasting covenant. So what we're going to do today is unpack what that ritual that happened on the Day of Atonement was all about, what it symbolized, how that is incredibly relevant to understanding what Jesus is all about in the New Testament, and then exploring what that means in our own times, especially through exploring the idea of self-sacrifice. So, if you go back to the book of Leviticus, that's where you find the instructions for what is supposed to happen on the Day of Atonement. And it's all about two goats. What would happen was that Aaron, who was the high priest in the temple, would cast lots over two goats. One of those goats would be for the Lord, and the other one for Azazel. Now, let's look at what happened to each of those two goats. Now, the first goat, the goat that was for the Lord, would be sacrificed. Its blood would then be brought by the high priest into the Holy of Holies and kind of sprinkled around. Now, there's very, very kind of powerful, deep mythic imagery going on here. What's happening is that blood, representing the kind of living creation, is being used to re-sacralize the Holy of Holies, to kind of renew the holiness of it. And then that blood is brought out into the temple from invisible creation into the visible part of creation and sprinkled there as well. So blood is representing life here, and it's being used to kind of renew the bond of the creation covenant. And because the high priest would also wear on his head the name of the Lord, Yahweh, there's also an element of self-sacrifice here, that the high priest is not just sacrificing the goat, but at some level sacrificing himself, that God is sacrificing himself in this ritual. It's kind of very multi-layered, powerful, rich imagery. The other goat, meanwhile, the one that was for Azazel, would be driven out into the wilderness. Now, who was Azazel? This is really interesting. Azazel, we know from the book of Enoch, was the leader of the angelic rebellion that we started to discover last time. And so what's happening here is that if the fallen angels are the ones that bring kind of sin and break the covenant, this is kind of driving that out away from the temple and into the wilderness. There's a kind of bearing of sins and sending them away. Now, this is all brought together then in the figure of Jesus in the New Testament, because of course, Jesus is doing all of these different roles at once. For one thing, Jesus is like a great high priest. The book of Hebrews is absolutely explicit about that, that's the way to kind of understand Jesus's role. Jesus is also the sacrifice. What's happening on the cross is that Jesus is being sacrificed and Jesus's blood is being used to kind of renew creation. And of course, there's also that element of self-sacrifice in just the same way as the high priest would wear the name of the Lord on the Day of Atonement. So Jesus is the Lord on the Day of Atonement on the cross. But also Jesus is being used as the scapegoat here. He's kind of bearing sin and taking it away from humanity, like that scapegoat that was being born into the wilderness. So there's this fascinating thing of all of the different threads of that Day of Atonement ritual in the Old Testament are brought together in what Jesus is doing on the cross. Now, what does this theme of sacrifice mean for us in our own times? And I think it's a really powerful one that we kind of uncover again and again in some of the most profound thinkers of our own times. Martin Luther King was really explicit about this. He said once that human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice. And if you look at Gandhi, he was even more explicit and specific about this. He said that the willing sacrifice of the innocent is the most powerful answer yet conceived by God or man to insolent tyranny. He's talking not just about sacrifice, but about self-sacrifice. And I think this is kind of, in some ways, the most profound idea in the Bible. It's obviously central to Jesus's mission, but it's also central, as we'll see, to what we're invited to as Christians. One of the things I find fascinating is that when you look at some of the most popular kind of films and books in our own times, this idea of self-sacrifice keeps bubbling up. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's there wherever you look. If you look, for instance, at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a hugely popular book and film, of course, Aslan's self-sacrifice is right at the heart of that story. Look at the massively successful Star Wars films and how there as well self-sacrifice is central. When Obi-Wan Kenobi is fighting Darth Vader at the end of the original Star Wars film, rather than continuing the fight, he puts up his lightsaber and allows himself to be struck down. Same story in Disney's Frozen movie, where Anna puts herself in the way of Prince Hans's sword blow there to save her sister Elsa from being struck down. Harry Potter's doing it in the last episode of the Harry Potter films in the Deathly Hallows. And finally, Gandalf does it in the Lord of the Rings story, as of course does Frodo in a different way. Now, in every one of these stories, what happens is first that the character who's allowing themselves to be struck down through that act of self-sacrifice is reborn. What seems like the final last act actually turns out to be the beginning of a resurrection. And often those characters come back not the same as they were before. So if you look at Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings movies, when he dies, he's Gandalf the Grey. When he comes back, he's Gandalf the White. And that's a lot like Jesus, of course, who comes back kind of different after the resurrection. Not all of his disciples recognize him. But also through that act of self-sacrifice, restoration is brought about. The mythic kind of story here is one about how the act of self-sacrifice brings things back together. In situations like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and Frozen, you see it depicted in the seasons where things have been stuck in winter with everything out of kilter. The normal cycle of the seasons is restored. And that's how you know that the everlasting covenant has been brought back into a healthy state through that act of self-sacrifice, through atonement. Something really deep and important is being described in all of these stories, a kind of profound psychological truth about how we kind of let go of the grasping ego of that little sense of who we are, die to that, and become reborn as something bigger, more aligned with the everlasting covenant, with our original purpose as kind of priests of creation, if you like. This is atonement as at one meant. It's atonement that takes something that's fragmented or fraying and makes it whole again, brings it back together, reunifies that which has been torn asunder. And of course, this is absolutely central to understanding who and what we are as Christians. The book of Romans, for example, specifically says that we're supposed to regard ourselves as living sacrifices. And of course, at the Last Supper, Jesus is inviting us also to join, to become participants in that sort of sacrifice and scapegoating and renewal of his atonement on the cross. So that's what we do every time we take the Eucharist. We're kind of drinking that blood that creates resurrection and renewal, just as the high priest in the first temple would sprinkle that blood around in the Holy of Holies and in the temple. And the result of this atonement, the result of our making ourselves living sacrifices and letting go of the kind of little grasping ego and becoming reborn as our deeper, larger, more connected selves is beautifully described in the book of Romans, which describes how the creation is waiting with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. So what we have here in kind of mythic terms is this very powerful, very deep description of how when the covenant is ruptured, when all of creation is at risk as a result, it's sacrifice, and particularly self-sacrifice, that is needed to bring things back into balance. And although we fear that that will involve us dying, actually we're reborn in our fullest sense. So that is a discussion of like how you mend a broken covenant in mythic terms. But in the next and final talk, we're going to get into what this means in practice, and above all, how we mend broken relationships and thereby heal the everlasting covenant in our own times.